Okay, hello everyone, welcome back. This is Professor Lei, and this video is for chapter 14, Supply Chain Integration. So in the previous two chapters, we already started to talk about different dimensions related to supply chain. So we first talked about how we basically properly design supply chain. Remember that we talked about basically the key trade-off between vertical integration and outsourcing. For instance, if you are a retailer within the supply chain, is it better for you to basically own your upstream supplier, or is better to basically co-work with your supplier as the outside partnership? All right. So we talk about the key trade-off, and also we already introduced a few different methods to basically help us find out the best strategy among alternatives. All right. Then after we design the supply chain, then we move to the second topic. Basically, is related to supply chain logistic network. Remember that basically in chapter 13, we detailedly talk about how we properly locate the specific facility or factory of the company, right? We introduced a few different methods like the center of gravity methods or low distance method to help us find the most appropriate facility location among alternatives. So in this specific chapter, we'll further talk about the integration within a supply chain. We all know that within a supply chain, we may have multiple members, right? Like the upstream supplier, like the manufacturer, like the delivery center, like the retailer, like the the end customer, right? So how we properly integrate different members within supply chain, how we can reach the coordination within a supply chain, that will be the main topic that we will discuss today. All right, now let's start. So here, I basically just list a few different learning objectives. We all know that if we cannot integrate the supply chain very well, then some disruption may happen. And actually, in this specific chapter, we will detailedly talk about basically what can be the potential causes of the supply chain disruption and what would be the consequences of the supply chain disruption. So all these things basically indicate that a great integration within supply chain is very necessary and is also very important. All right, we'll also introduce a new generated operative supply chain technology called additive manufacturing. We will detailedly talk about basically what it is and what will be the impact of this type of technology on the supply chain integration process. All right, and then we will jump into the supply chain integration process, which actually in general includes 4 different nested processes. All right, we will start talking about the new service or product development process and introduce some important methods related to that. And then we will move to the second process, which is related to supplier relationship process. And of course, we will also introduce some quantitative methods to help us reach to an acceptable level related to this whole process. All right. And then we will move to the order fulfillment process. This is another very important nested process within the integrated supply chain process. All right. And we will also introduce some specific rules within this specific process. Finally, we'll come to the customer relationship process. This is also a very important process since all of the integrations within the supply chain finally will link to the end customer. All right. And the last objective that we will learn within this specific chapter will be the supply chain risk management. All right, we will introduce what kind of the risk are specifically within the supply chain and how we deal with different type of the risks. All right, now let's start. We start from the definition of supply chain integration. Right, within a supply chain, normally we have multiple members. So from the upstream to downstream, normally we will have the upstream supplier, we will have manufacturer, and then after manufacturer produce the product, they probably will send the products or the services to the delivery center, right? And then the delivery center will give it to the retailer for the end sale from the customer, right? So this will be a very standard flow within a supply chain. All right. So what is the supply chain integration? So basically, its definition here is very straightforward. Basically, we try to use different methods to effectively coordinate the whole process within supply chain among different members within the supply chain, as what we just mentioned. All right. So we know that there are there are many different information through this whole flow, how we can effectively coordinate different information such that, every members can effectively work their specific parts within the supply chain. That is also connecting to the integration of the whole supply chain. All right, now let's continue. Here, the figure 14.1 basically shows a very straightforward example related to supply chain, right? Suppose you are a ketchup factory. Normally, you will have some upstream suppliers basically preparing the raw materials for you, right? For basically the raw material of the ketchup, right? And then after you get all of those raw material, you make the basically ketchup. You deliver to the distributor, and the distributor will further deliver to the retail store for the preparation of the customer purchase, right? So you can clearly see that this will be a very standard supply chain. And here I list two different flows. The first one is called information flow. Obviously, since the upstream firm has to prepare the raw material first before it moves to the manufacturing process, before it moves to the delivery process, and then the selling process, then the information flow basically is coming from upstream back to downstream, right? However, the cash flow will be entirely opposite from the most downstream, back to the upstream. This is actually very straightforward because the customer has to pay for the specific goods, right? That's why the cash flow is actually moving from the downstream back to the most upstream first, right? This is actually very intuitive. Now, let's move to the supply chain disruptions. So before we even talk about the supply chain integration, let's first look at what can be the possible causes of the supply chain disruptions. You can already imagine many different kinds of the reasons that finally will lead to the supply chain disruptions. So here, basically, I classify into two different types. One is called external causes. Another specific type is called internal causes. First, let's look at the external causes. All right. Normally, the external causes are those causes that is actually out of your control, right? Let's look at all those different possible factors. If we have environmental disruptions, for instance, if there is an earthquake, unfortunately, within one region, and if your supplier or if your delivery center is exactly locating within this region, then probably you will have some, supply chain disruption, and your production line, your service line may actually get affected because of that, right? Or if the supply chain is too complicated, right, such that, it's very hard for, different members to coordinate simultaneously without any errors through this whole process, then it may also cause some supply chain disruptions. All right. And besides that, if, for instance, if your supplier do not actually co-work with you anymore, and if you cannot actually find another alternative supplier to replace his role, right, it may also lead to the disruption of your supply chain, right? Then if we move to the customer side, all right, if the customer induced volume changes drastically, it's very hard for our supply chains to better predict and also prepare for the product or service for the certain volume of the customer needs, right? In those cases, you may prepare more than enough, you may prepare much less than enough. So they will also cause some supply chain disruptions. Or if we back to the supplier side, right? Even if the supplier is actually working with you, even they promise you to basically deliver certain amount of products on what specific time, but they may actually have some issue in their internal process such that they cannot actually deliver those amounts actually promised to you, right? So in those cases, some late deliveries will definitely affect your own production or service process, will also affect, your downstream company for the service or for the product, which is actually provided to the customers. All right. So all those different, factors may actually affect the supply chain performance and may even lead to the disruption within the supply chain. All right. Now let's also look at some internal causes that may lead to supply chain disruptions. All right. For instance, even if you actually have a very nice, very accurate market demand prediction, all right. However, if you do not actually have enough inventory prepared for, let's say, the growing market demand for this specific type of product or service, then still you will face, disruption within the supply chain because, you cannot deliver the enough amount of the products from your factory to the retail store for the sale, all right? Or if you have enough inventory, but you find out that based on the quality test, some of them actually cannot actually reach to acceptable level, such that even if you have enough amount, but you cannot deliver those defective products to your customer, right? It will also cause some supply chain disruptions, right? Or as what we just mentioned, if the supply chain complexity itself is too high, you cannot actually easily coordinate with your upstream firm and also your downstream firm, then the disruptive kind of the issues will also occur within the whole supply chain, right? Also, if you try to change your design of the product or service, okay, very drastically, then do you have enough experts? Do you have enough facility and equipments? If you cannot prepare all those different things properly before the new design of no matter products or services, you will also cause some disruption within your whole supply chain. All right, I will not talk about every single point that I list here, but the key point is that basically you can see that no matter it's external causes or internal causes, many different causes may actually result in the disruption within supply chain, which can really damage the whole supply chain performance. So that's why it's very important for us to understand, how we can properly integrate or coordinate every single supply chain member within the whole supply chain. Very important. Now let's continue. So from dynamics perspective, we all know that basically, for example, for a downstream company, right, within his ordering process, there is some variation. And what we are curious is that if we know that there is some variation within the downstream firm, okay, how this variation will impact the corresponding upstream firms within the same supply chain. If this variation will keep at the same level, or it will actually changes to a different level, all right? Actually, we already found this phenomenon very widely occurs within different supply chains, which is called Bove effect. Let's directly look at what is the key sense of Bove effect. Here, suppose we know that there is some small variation within the downstream firm. We basically show that there's some small variation from customer daily demands, right? However, see, this small variation went back to the upstream firms, all right, within the same supply chain. You can see that basically the variation itself becomes larger and larger, okay, when it moves back to the more and more upstream firms. Okay, so basically the Bove effect tells us, even if there is a small variation at the beginning, okay, but if we move back to, let's say, the upstream firms within the supply chain, this kind of the variation will increases when it goes further and further back to the upstream firms. So a small variation can lead to a very high variation of the upstream firm according to that. Okay, so the Bove effect that actually show within the supply chain is a little bit like the butterfly effect. Okay, many of you guys probably have already heard about this effect, right? So it basically tells us if you do not coordinate or integrate the whole supply chain well, even if there is a very small uncertainty or very small fluctuation, can cause a very high, fluctuation or high uncertainty when back to the upstream firm. Okay, which basically indicates that the supply chain integration itself is very important in order to further improve the overall supply chain performance. All right, now let's continue. Now we jump into the specific supply chain integration process. All right, now you can clearly see here within a supply chain, in order to integrate the whole supply chain, there are 4 different nested processes that we have to deal with and also need to improve, all right? The middle 2 process, like new service or product development process or order fulfillment process are more internal. However, the supplier relationship process is more related to how we basically negotiate with the upstream firm, all right? And on the other hand, the customer relationship process is more related to how we can negotiate, how we can deal with the downstream firm. So it's quite important to understand the key sense of every one single process. And also, since all those 4 different processes are linking with each other, it's better to also understand what is the relationship between every one process in order to finally reach the final target of making an integrated supply chain. And we will talk about every single process just in a second. Okay, let's continue. Here, I also introduce one specific term called additive manufacturing. The reason is very simple. Nowadays, we all know that actually the technology is growing very fastly, right? The additive manufacturing is a new generated high technology that is more and more popular within different industry, all right? And here, basically, we just provide you an example of how the new technology will also impact the overall supply chain integration. Actually, the key sense of additive manufacturing is very simple. Basically records the 3D printing. Basically, the 3D design is based on the computer-aided design, and then we use the printing equipment to lay down successive layers of liquid, powder, sheet material, or other materials in order to finally make the whole 3D object. All right, and this new technology definitely will have some specific supply chain implications towards every single member within the supply chain. All right, as I list here, it may reduce the material inputs, it may simplify the production, right? It will also impact the overall supply chain network. It may also increase the supply chain flexibility. But on the other hand, the 3D printing does actually set a higher level of the requirements. So if you want to basically use 3D printing within production or service process, you also need to consider all of those prerequisite requirements before you basically adopt additive manufacturing process. All right. So if you want to look at more details related to additive manufacturing, you can reach to me or you can actually look through some materials online directly. All right. Thank you.